Hi, my name is Tom. I'm an Ableton certified trainer. And in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the creative ways you can use Ableton Live's built-in distortion devices to manipulate and add interest to your sounds. So I've got a kind of basic loop here to start us off, and we're going to take the sounds in this loop and just make them a little bit more interesting. So let's hear what we've got first. So we've got kind of a drum part, bass part, chord pattern here, and we've got this kind of lead line which we'll bring in a little bit later on. Got a couple of drum variations we can work with as well. So immediately you'll hear these drums are sounding a little bit soft, a little bit kind of weak. They need a bit of beefing up. So the first device that we're going to use is the Saturator device. The Saturator is a sort of relatively simple seeming but fairly powerful saturation device. And there are a number of different kind of saturation modes that you can do all kinds of different distortion with. But one of the ways that I like to use the Saturator is kind of almost as a limiter clipping device. And it's a really good way to kind of beef out, particularly around drums, but sort of any part, give it a lot of kind of fullness and just a little bit of a sort of hint of color. So we're going to stay in this analog clip mode. Let me just solo the drum so we can focus on that for now. And we'll leave soft clip on. So Saturator has various different clipping modes, which sort of handles how it distorts if the volume goes over 0 dBFS. We're going to leave it on soft clip for now. And just increase the drive control until we start hearing a little bit of distortion. We might need to compensate by turning the output down a little bit because it can get a little bit loud. And you can hear we can really drive that into distortion. But we'll pull it back just a little bit. Just so it's kind of really adding some fullness to our drum parts. And just a hint of saturation. So it's almost kind of functioning like a limiter. So really, really simple tool. I kind of shove that on almost all of my drum tracks, and the amount of drive that you're going to apply is going to vary based on the sort of level going in, but it just gives you a nice kind of smooth rounding effect on, particularly on drums. So let's take a look at another effect and maybe a kind of more unconventional way of using this particular effect. That is the pedal distortion. So pedal, you might think of guitars, maybe synths is where you might use the pedal effect. It's kind of designed to emulate guitar pedals. But where it actually works really well, I find, is on kick drums. And depending on the style of kick drum, whether you've got like a boomy 808 style kick drum, this more sort of punchy 909 techno style kick drum, it can really add different kinds of character. It can like enhance the boom of a big 808, or it can really add some punch and grit to a more sort of techno style bass drum. So I'm going to drag pedal directly onto the bass drum in the drum rack here. Now, the very first thing that we want to do in this particular instance is enable this sub option, because the pedal naturally kind of removes a bit of the sub frequencies. So this sub button is there to bring those back. Obviously with the kick drum, we want nice kind of boomy low end. So we're going to turn that on and then just crank the gain up on the pedal device. And you can hear I can go sort of pretty hard with it. I can't really hear much of the rest of the drums because the kick's gotten very loud. But if I just solo the kick for a second, you can hear it adds that real kind of growly punch to the kick drum, which sounds great. Put it back a little bit. And you can try some of the different modes. We've got distort, fuzz, a little bit too much. I quite like the overdrive modes, nice round and kind of warm and analog sounding. And then we probably just want to pull the output down to kind of balance this now with the rest of our drum kits. So I'll turn it off. Yeah, it really adds a bit of flavor to that kick drum. Okay, let's bring in some of our other parts. Okay, I'm going to turn the bass off for now, and we'll focus on these chords here. Now, what I want to do is make these chords kind of a little bit more dubby. We'll go for like a kind of dub techno vibe. And you might think, oh, let's reach for like a delay or an echo. But we're actually going to go for raw. Ableton's raw distortion device. We're going to load that onto the chords. And the reason we're going to do this is because in raw, so this is a very deep distortion device, there's a lot that we can do with it, but we have these various different routing modes. At the moment we're in the single routing mode, but there's this relatively new feedback routing mode. If we switch to the feedback routing mode, what that lets us do is apply different distortion to the direct signal versus the feedback signal, because raw has this feedback section. And you can actually use this to kind of emulate a delay. So if I play this now, and over my feedback section, I'm going to increase the feedback amount. And I'll increase the feedback time as well. And what you can start to hear is we're getting kind of echo-style delays. Maybe I'll switch this feedback mode to a synced rate. And let's go with, in fact, I'm going to set it to a dotted rate. We'll go with like dotted eighths. Now I've got that kind of basic delay effect going. I can go over to the feedback routing here, or the feedback signal path, and I can apply some distortion just to the feedback. Be careful here though, because as I increase the amount, this is going to increase the amount of feedback going into my delay. So you might want to bounce between the distortion and the amount control here. And here I can really start to get that kind of distorted feedback, which is quite nice, really kind of characterful, a bit more interesting than just sort of a standard delay. And then what gets pretty fun is we can try some of the other distortion modes here. For example, I really like this shards mode. And if I increase the bias on this, what you'll hear is it starts to kind of break up the distortion. Get these kind of really interesting sort of sharp, prickly, clicky sounds. But just on the delays, the direct signal is unaffected. Which can sound really interesting. So there's of course a lot more that we can explore here in just creating these really interesting sort of distorted delay lines. But that's just one really fun thing that you can do with raw. So let's move over to our bass line. I'll bring this bass line in. Now, if I solo this, I've got a bit of sidechain compression going, but this is a relatively boring bass line, just kind of a static note. So let's again use raw to make this a whole lot more interesting. So I'll drop raw on this bass line. And I'll immediately just, I'm going to leave it in this sort of single routing here for now, and I'll immediately just crank up the distortion. And let's switch to maybe the polynomial mode. We can try different modes out here. Fractal, it's a little bit harsh. We'll do polynomial. But what's really fun about raw is we've got this really sort of deep, complex modulation section. I can click this tab to open that up, and I can apply modulation to various controls within raw. So for example, let's modulate this distortion amount. So to do that, I just click on the control I want to modulate, go over to the matrix here, and let's apply some noise to this. We're going to just apply some kind of random movement. So I'll increase the amount. Let's go over to the noise just by clicking on that tab. Let's maybe increase the rate of this. You can hear how that distortion, let's maybe switch to the wander mode. It's quite nice. It's just getting randomly modulated, already making that bass sound a little bit more interesting. There's a bit more movement to it. And of course we could play around with the distortion mode, but we'll stick with that for now. Let's switch this into a serial routing mode, so we can actually have multiple stages of distortion. So we've got our first stage kind of doing this thing over here. In the second stage, I'll again crank up the distortion. I'll maybe turn the filter on here. Just kind of low pass that. And here we can modulate this distortion amount, but let's do this using the envelope follower. So the envelope follower lets us use the kind of volume envelope of a signal to modulate controls. And that could either be the envelope of the signal we're affecting, in this case the bass, but we can also use an external source. So I click this tab over here, set an external sidechain, and I'll select the 909 drum track. So I've obviously got the bass solo at the moment, but you should be able to see the 909 coming in there. in the envelope, we should see the kind of volume envelope of the 909. I can then take this envelope, go over to the matrix, and apply this to Shaper 2. And you can already hear, even though we can't hear the drums at the moment because the bass is soloed, you can sort of hear the rhythm of the drums affecting the bass. Over in the envelope section here, we can play with things like what frequency inputs we're hearing from the drums. You can use this little preview icon to hear the actual sidechain signal. So let's maybe kind of filter this down a bit, sort of around the mid-range. So we've got this kind of plucky envelope coming in here. We can sort of turn the gain up and then even increase the threshold. So we only get modulation just on the sort of peaks of the sound. And I'll go out of preview mode. Here that's kind of really following the pattern of the drums, even so much so that if I change the drum beat, you can hear how that affects the rhythm of the bass. So it's a really cool way of having this relationship between different parts of your track. So if I turn off raw, there's our bass line that we had before. Pretty boring. But raw's just added a whole lot of movement to that bass. Let's look at one more example of an interesting way we can use distortion to add a bit of kind of modulation and interest here. I'll bring in this lead part. So the sound is a little bit static. We want to add a bit of movement to it. So we'll use kind of another one of Live's maybe a little bit slept on distortion devices, and that is erosion. And it is a bit of a sort of esoteric device. You've got these three different modes: noise, wide noise, and sine. And you can just really quickly kind of hear what they sound like by grabbing this sort of XY node and moving it around. So you can hear the sine mode is kind of almost like a bit crusher. Has this really kind of interesting ringing characteristic to it. Noise adds this kind of really nice noise signal. And what can be really interesting with this device is to modulate it a bit. So we'll just grab the LFO, just a standard Max for Live modulator, and map this to the frequency control. We'll set it to remote mode. And now you can see that we'll maybe slow the rate down here. Set it to kind of stray on the LFO. Maybe restrict the range of the LFO a little bit. Just like really slow the rate down. And now we have this really interesting sort of modulated noise creating movement on top of that sound. So Live actually has a whole bunch of other really interesting distortion devices. Even things like the drum bus has distortion. Even the Echo device has a built-in input saturation. There's things like the overdrive device, dynamic tube. There's lots of really interesting distortion devices that are built into Live that let you add a lot of kind of character and flavor in various different ways. And so we've seen in this video some maybe slightly more unconventional ways to use them, using pedal on the kick drum, using raw to kind of create that dub delay effect. There's a lot of sort of diversity and interest that you can get in your sound design using Live's built-in distortion effects.